Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote mountain regions of Colorado Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1893 in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was particularly harsh, with snow blocking most passes until late April. It was during this isolated season that the residents of Crestone Valley first noticed something peculiar about the hide deliveries made by Zachariah Whitmore, a fur trader who had appeared in their settlement the previous autumn. According to parish records kept by Father Cornelius Ashford at the small Catholic mission, Whitmore had arrived in October 1892, claiming to represent a consortium of trappers working the high country. He was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore unusual scars, described by witnesses as appearing almost ritualistic in their precision. The priest noted in his weekly reports to the diocese that Whitmore spoke little about his past, mentioning only that he had previously worked territories further north, where the wildlife runs different. The settlement of Crestone Valley consisted of approximately 30 adult souls, mostly miners, married couples, and a handful of merchants who supplied the scattered claims dotting the mountainsides. The community had grown around a natural spring and the modest protection offered by a narrow canyon, which provided shelter from the relentless mountain winds. Most residents lived in simple log structures, with the more prosperous couples occupying two-room cabins equipped with stone fireplaces. The valley's formation dated back centuries, carved by glacial action that had created a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering peaks. The Ute tribes had long considered the area significant, referring to it in their oral traditions as a place where the earth speaks to those who listen properly. These indigenous accounts, recorded sporadically by territorial surveyor Nathaniel Crawford in his 1891 expedition notes, described the valley as a location where spirits of the deep places could communicate with the surface world. Crawford's geological survey had identified several cave systems in the surrounding cliffs, though the harsh climate and dangerous terrain had prevented thorough exploration. His notes, preserved in territorial archives, mentioned unusual acoustic properties in certain caves that seemed to amplify and carry sounds in ways that defied normal acoustic principles. Local Ute guides had refused to enter these cave systems, claiming they were places of calling that could trap the unwary. The surveyor's documentation included detailed sketches of cave entrances that featured geometric patterns carved into the surrounding rock. These patterns appeared to be ancient, predating any known historical presence in the area, yet showed precision that suggested sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles. Crawford noted that similar patterns appeared throughout the cave systems, always positioned where they would be immediately visible to anyone entering the passages. Whitmore established his trading post in an abandoned prospector's cabin at the mouth of Dead Horse Canyon, approximately 2 miles from the main settlement. The location struck many as peculiar, given its isolation and the fact that previous attempts to use the site had failed. The cabin had been built in 1889 by Jeremiah Slocum, a prospector who had abandoned it after reporting persistent disturbances that made sleep impossible. Slocum's departure had been abrupt, leaving behind tools, supplies, and personal belongings that suggested no intention of permanent abandonment. When questioned by other prospectors about his hasty exit, Slocum claimed he had discovered signs of previous habitation in nearby caves, including arrangements of human bones and symbols carved deep into living rock. He insisted that staying longer would have meant accepting an invitation I wasn't prepared to answer. The cabin's interior bore evidence of Slocum's disturbing final weeks. Carved into the wooden walls were geometric patterns that resembled no known indigenous designs. These carvings appeared to have been made with desperate urgency, often overlapping and intersecting in ways that created optical illusions when viewed by lamplight. Slocum had also covered every window with multiple layers of boards, creating an environment of perpetual darkness even during daylight hours. The patterns carved by Slocum showed remarkable similarity to those documented by Crawford in the cave systems, suggesting either that the prospector had discovered and copied the ancient designs, or that the same influence responsible for the cave markings had affected his behavior during his final weeks in the cabin. The precision and mathematical complexity of the carvings seemed inconsistent with the work of a mentally disturbed individual, yet their desperate execution suggested extreme psychological distress. When Whitmore took possession of the cabin, he made few modifications to Slocum's arrangements. He removed the window coverings but left the wall carvings intact, claiming they added character to the space. Visitors to his trading post noted that the patterns seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally, though direct examination revealed only static carved lines. The hide trader's first deliveries were unremarkable. He provided quality deer, elk, and mountain sheep pelts to the valley's residents, who used them for winter clothing, bedding, and trade with supply wagons that occasionally made the treacherous journey up from the Colorado plains. His prices were fair, and his goods appeared to be of exceptional quality. Several couples, including the Kesslers who ran the general store, noted that Whitmore's hides seemed unusually well preserved and bore a distinctive, almost sweet odor that lingered long after the transaction. Evangeline Kessler, wife of the store owner, maintained a detailed household ledger that survived the decades and was eventually donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1961. Her entries from November 1892 provide insight into the community's initial impressions of their new trader. She wrote, "Mr. Whitmore delivered 6 deer hides today. Rupert was pleased with the quality, though I remarked that the fur felt different somehow, softer than what we typically see from local hunters. The hide seems almost warm to the touch, as though it retains some vestige of the animal's life force." My Evangeline's observations proved more perceptive than anyone initially realized. Her detailed descriptions of Whitmore's early deliveries noted subtle inconsistencies that would later prove significant. She recorded variations in fur patterns that didn't match seasonal expectations, hide dimensions that exceeded normal proportions for the claimed species, and preservation techniques that left the pelts unusually pliable, despite apparent age. The woman's scientific curiosity, unusual for frontier wives of that era, led her to begin a personal collection of hair and fur samples from Whitmore's deliveries, pressing them between pages of her personal journal, along with detailed notes about their characteristics. This collection would later provide crucial evidence for investigators attempting to understand the true nature of Whitmore's trade goods. As winter deepened, Whitmore's visits became more frequent, often arriving during snowstorms that would have made travel extremely dangerous for most men. He always came alone, leading a pack horse loaded with carefully wrapped bundles. Residents noticed that despite the harsh weather, he never appeared tired or cold, and his horse always seemed well fed, even when local livestock were struggling with scarce fodder. The trader's apparent immunity to cold weather became a topic of frequent discussion among valley residents. Temperatures during the winter of 1892-93 regularly dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, yet Whitmore traveled mountain passes wearing only standard wool clothing. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, showed none of the signs of stress typically exhibited by animals subjected to extreme cold exposure. Dr. Mordecai Thorne, the valley's only physician, began keeping informal notes about Whitmore's visits after observing several peculiarities. The doctor, who had received his medical training at Johns Hopkins before seeking his fortune in the Colorado Territory, possessed a scientific mind that found certain aspects of the hide trader's business troubling. His medical practice in more civilized areas had included treating numerous cases of frostbite, exposure, and cold-related injuries, making him particularly qualified to recognize the anomalies in Whitmore's apparent cold resistance. In December 1892, Dr. Thorne wrote to a former colleague, "I have encountered a most curious individual here in our mountain settlement. His wares are of extraordinary quality, yet I cannot identify the source of several hides he has provided. The fur patterns and coloring do not match any indigenous species with which I am familiar, despite 20 years of hunting and specimen collection throughout the Rocky Mountain region. More puzzling is his apparent immunity to weather conditions that severely tax even the most experienced mountain men." The doctor's medical training included significant study of comparative anatomy, making his inability to identify certain species particularly troubling. During his years in Colorado, Dr. Thorne had built an extensive collection of specimens from local wildlife, systematically cataloging the variations in fur patterns, bone structures, and other identifying characteristics. His expertise was recognized by the Territorial Naturalist Society, which regularly requested his assistance in classifying unusual specimens. When Dr. Thorne examined Whitmore's hides using his standard classification methods, he found characteristics that seemed to combine features from multiple species in ways that should not have been possible through natural means. Fur density patterns suggested Arctic adaptation, yet color variations indicated temperate climate evolution. Bone attachment points visible on the hide edges corresponded to skeletal structures he could not match to any known North American mammals. The first truly unsettling incident occurred in January 1893 when Josiah Brennan, a veteran hunter who had worked the Colorado mountains since the 1860s, examined several of Whitmore's recent deliveries at the Kessler store. Brennan had an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife, having served as a guide for numerous scientific expeditions including the Wheeler Survey of 1875 and the Powell Geographic Expedition of 1878. His expertise was so well regarded that territorial officials regularly consulted him on matters related to wildlife management and resource assessment. Brennan's examination of Whitmore's hides revealed inconsistencies that troubled him deeply. He had personally tracked, killed, and processed hundreds of animals throughout his career, developing an almost instinctive understanding of how different species' hides should look, feel, and smell. The hides provided by Whitmore violated several fundamental principles of his accumulated knowledge. According to Evangeline Kessler's ledger, Brennan told her, "Ma'am, I've seen every creature that walks, crawls, or flies in these mountains, and I can tell you with certainty that some of these pelts ain't from anything that belongs here. That white one with the blue undertones, the trader claims it's from an albino deer, but the fur pattern's all wrong. Albino deer keep their normal fur structure, just lose the pigmentation. This hide shows fur growth patterns I've never seen, like it was adapted for conditions that don't exist in Colorado." Brennan's concerns extended beyond simple species identification. His experienced eye detected signs of processing techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than anything available in frontier settlements. The hides showed evidence of preservation methods that left them remarkably supple and fresh-smelling despite apparent age. Traditional smoking, salt curing, or brain tanning processes could not have achieved similar results. The veteran hunter also noticed that several hides appeared to have been modified after the initial processing. Careful examination revealed almost invisible seams where pieces from different animals had been joined together. These modifications were executed with such skill that they were nearly undetectable, requiring close inspection under good lighting to identify. The purpose of such modifications remained unclear, but the level of craftsmanship suggested involvement by individuals with specialized training. When Evangeline relayed Brennan's concerns to her husband, they decided to question Whitmore directly during his next visit. However, The trader's responses only deepened the mystery. He claimed his hides came from various elevations, including areas beyond the tree line where creatures adapt differently to the conditions. When pressed for specific locations, he provided vague references to high valleys and hidden basins that none of the local hunters recognized. Whitmore's explanations were delivered with confident authority, but they contained geographical references that made no sense to residents who had spent years exploring the surrounding mountains. He mentioned valleys that supposedly existed above the cloud line, where animals had developed unique adaptations to extreme altitude. Such descriptions contradicted basic biological principles, as higher elevations generally supported less diverse wildlife populations, not more specialized ones. The trader also claimed to work with indigenous hunting guides who possessed traditional knowledge passed down through generations. He described techniques for tracking animals in terrain that other hunters considered impassable, and methods for preserving hides that produced superior results compared to European-derived processes. However, when local residents attempted to verify these claims with Ute tribal members who occasionally traded in the valley, they found no knowledge of such techniques or individuals. The situation grew more peculiar when several couples reported unusual dreams after acquiring Whitmore's hides. Ingrid Kessler, Evangeline's sister-in-law, noted in letters to relatives in Denver that she had begun experiencing vivid nightmares after using one of Whitmore's deer hides as a bed covering. She described dreams of being watched by eyes that seemed to follow her through dark forests, and of hearing whispers in languages she didn't recognize. The dreams reported by Ingrid Kessler possessed unusual clarity and consistency. Unlike typical nightmares that fade upon awakening, these visions remained vivid throughout the day, often feeling more real than actual memories. She described walking through underground passages carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. The passages led to vast chambers where groups of people engaged in activities she could observe but not understand. Most disturbing were the voices in these dreams. Ingrid reported hearing conversations in what sounded like multiple languages, though she could understand fragments despite having no knowledge of any language other than English and basic German. The conversations seemed to concern preparations for some unspecified event, with references to surface dwellers and completion of the arrangement. Similar reports emerged from other families. The Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who had purchased bear hides for their cabin walls, complained of persistent scratching sounds within their walls that only occurred at night. Those sounds followed no pattern that would suggest rodent or insect infestation, instead occurring in rhythmic sequences that seemed almost communicative in nature. The Henderson couple's experiences escalated beyond simple auditory disturbances. Martha Henderson reported finding small objects in their cabin that she couldn't remember acquiring: carved bone items, unusual stones, and what appeared to be primitive tools made from unfamiliar materials. These objects appeared overnight, always in locations where they would be immediately noticed, as though deliberately placed for discovery. John Henderson attempted to track the source of these mysterious additions to their household. He began sleeping in shifts with his wife, ensuring that someone remained awake throughout each night. However, the objects continued to appear even during periods of constant vigilance. On one occasion, a carved wooden item appeared on their dining table, while John sat reading less than 6 feet away. He reported noticing the object immediately upon its appearance, yet could not recall any movement or sound that might have indicated how it arrived. The Olsons, an elderly couple who ran a small blacksmith operation, reported that their livestock began displaying unusual behavior after they acquired rabbit fur blankets from Whitmore's stock. Their horses and cattle showed signs of distress whenever brought near the blankets, refusing to enter areas where the materials had been placed. Dr. Thorne's examination found no medical explanation for the animals' reactions. leading him to suspect that the hides possessed some property that affected sensitive creatures in ways humans couldn't immediately perceive. Dr. Thorne attempted a more systematic investigation, requesting permission to examine several of Whitmore's hides in detail. The trader initially resisted claiming trade secrets, but eventually allowed the doctor to study 3 specimens under controlled conditions. Thorne's findings, preserved in his medical journal, were deeply troubling. Upon microscopic examination, he wrote, the fur samples display cellular structures that are inconsistent with known North American mammals. The hair follicle patterns suggest adaptation to extreme conditions, yet not those found at our elevation or climate. Most disturbing is the presence of what appears to be scarring in the hide tissue, forming regular patterns that suggest intentional modification rather than natural growth or injury. Dr. Thorne's medical training included significant exposure to pathology and anatomical studies, making his observations particularly credible. His microscopic examination revealed cellular structures that appeared to combine characteristics from multiple species in ways that defied normal biological development. Hair shaft compositions showed mineral content that didn't match any known regional environmental conditions. The scarring patterns discovered by Dr. Thorne followed geometric designs that appeared throughout Whitmore's operation. These weren't random injury marks or natural blemishes, but deliberate modifications that had been made while the animals were alive, then allowed to heal before harvesting. The precision and consistency of these patterns suggested a systematic approach that required considerable knowledge of animal physiology and healing processes. When Dr. Thorne shared his findings with Father Ashford, the priest became increasingly concerned about Whitmore's presence in their community. The priest began maintaining his own observations, noting in his correspondence with the diocese that several parishioners had reported feeling spiritually uneasy after contact with the trader's goods. Father Ashford's educational background included seminary training in theology and philosophy, but also substantial study of natural history and scientific methodology. The Catholic Church's traditional emphasis on rational investigation of natural phenomena had prepared him to evaluate claims of unusual occurrences with both skepticism and thoroughness. His growing concern about Whitmore reflected careful observation rather than superstitious fear. The priest's letters to diocesan authorities, discovered in church archives in 1954, revealed his systematic approach to documenting the unusual experiences reported by his parishioners. He conducted detailed interviews with affected families, cross-referencing their accounts to identify common elements and eliminate purely subjective interpretations. His findings showed consistent patterns that suggested external causation rather than mass hysteria or suggestion. Father Ashford wrote, "I have counseled several families who report distressing experiences following their commerce with this Whitmore fellow. While I am hesitant to attribute supernatural causes to mundane events, I cannot ignore the consistent nature of these reports. The affected individuals describe experiences that share remarkable similarities, despite having no opportunity for collaboration or mutual influence. These include dreams, featuring identical geographical locations, auditory phenomena occurring at consistent times, and physical sensations that follow predictable patterns." The priest's concerns intensified when he noticed that Whitmore never attended church services, despite the strong religious observance that characterized most frontier communities. When Father Ashford approached him about attending Mass, Whitmore politely declined, stating that he followed older practices that predated Christianity in the region. Whitmore's reference to older practices intrigued Father Ashford, who possessed considerable knowledge of indigenous spiritual traditions throughout the Rocky Mountain region. During his seminary studies, he had written extensive papers on the relationship between Christian doctrine and existing native belief systems. developing expertise in comparative religious practices that few frontier priests possessed. When Father Ashford attempted to engage Whitmore in discussions about these older practices, the trader proved evasive but knowledgeable. He demonstrated familiarity with Ute spiritual concepts, particularly those related to underground spaces and communication with subterranean entities. However, his knowledge extended beyond any single tribal tradition, incorporating elements from multiple indigenous cultures in ways that suggested either extensive travel or access to sources of information unavailable to most frontier traders. As February turned to March, Whitmore's visits became increasingly frequent, sometimes occurring weekly instead of monthly. His pack horse carried larger loads, and the variety of hides expanded to include species that none of the local hunters could identify. One particular hide, which he described as coming from a mountain cat, measured nearly 8 feet in length and displayed a striped pattern unlike any known feline species in North America. The increase in Whitmore's deliveries coincided with observable changes in his personal behavior. Residents noted that he seemed more focused and purposeful during his visits, spending less time on casual conversation and more time examining potential customers with an intensity that made many uncomfortable. His interactions became increasingly transaction-oriented, as though he was working toward some deadline that required efficient completion of his business. Evangeline Kessler documented these behavioral changes in her household ledger, noting that Whitmore's conversations had shifted from general topics to specific questions about family structures, individual health conditions, and personal preferences regarding various hide types. His inquiries seemed designed to gather detailed information about community members, rather than simply facilitate commerce. The exotic hides provided during this period showed characteristics that challenged even Dr. Thorne's scientific understanding. The alleged mountain cat hide displayed fur patterns that seemed to shift under different lighting conditions, creating optical effects that made accurate examination difficult. Chemical tests revealed mineral compositions that didn't match any known regional geological formations. Josiah Brennan's growing suspicions led him to attempt following Whitmore on one of his departure trips from the valley. The hunter waited until Whitmore completed his rounds and began heading back toward Dead Horse Canyon, then followed at a distance using tracking skills developed over decades of wilderness experience. Brennan's pursuit required considerable expertise, as Whitmore seemed aware of potential surveillance and took precautions to avoid leaving clear tracks. The trader's route through the mountain terrain followed paths that seemed deliberately chosen to minimize visibility and maximize confusion for anyone attempting to follow. He utilized natural terrain features to break up his trail and employed techniques that suggested professional training in counter-surveillance methods. According to Brennan's account, recorded years later by a territorial marshal investigating unrelated matters, Whitmore's route took him not toward the high country, as expected, but deeper into the canyon system. The trader followed game trails that led through narrow defiles and across exposed rock faces where footprints would be impossible to track. "I followed him for about 3 miles," Brennan reported, "until the canyon walls got too narrow and steep for safe passage in the snow. But before I turned back, I heard something that stopped me cold. It wasn't human voices, but it wasn't animal sounds either. It was like singing, but with words in no language I'd ever heard. The rhythm was regular, like a work song, but the pitch rose and fell in ways that hurt to listen to. And there was a smell carrying on the wind, sweet but wrong, like flowers that had been dead too long, but somehow still growing." Brennan's description of the sounds emanating from the deeper canyon matched reports from other residents who had ventured near the area during Whitmore's visits. The vocalizations seemed to serve some coordinating function, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication rather than random noise. The acoustic properties of the canyon walls amplified and carried these sounds in ways that made their exact source impossible to determine. The smell described by Brennan proved to be another consistent element in various accounts. Multiple witnesses reported detecting an odor that combined floral sweetness with something organic and decaying. The smell seemed strongest during Whitmore's absences, suggesting that whatever produced it remained active in the canyon even when the trader was not present. Brennan's investigation attempt marked a turning point in the community's relationship with Whitmore. Word of the hunter's experience spread quickly through the small settlement, creating an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Several couples began refusing Whitmore's goods, claiming they no longer needed additional hides despite the ongoing harsh weather. The community's growing reluctance to deal with Whitmore created practical problems, as his hides had become an important resource for surviving the harsh mountain winter. Alternative sources of processed hides required dangerous journeys to distant settlements, and the quality of available substitutes was significantly inferior to Whitmore's products. This created a dilemma for families who needed the materials but feared the consequences of continued association with the trader. Dr. Thorne decided to conduct his own investigation, approaching the matter with scientific methodology. He began keeping detailed records of everyone who had purchased Whitmore's hides, noting any subsequent health complaints or unusual experiences. His findings, compiled over several weeks, showed a clear pattern of sleep disturbances, anxiety, and what he termed nervous afflictions among couples who had acquired the trader's goods. The doctor's systematic approach revealed correlations that might have been missed through casual observation. Families who had acquired larger quantities of Whitmore's hides showed more severe symptoms, and those who used the hides for bedding or clothing experienced effects more quickly than those who used them for decorative purposes. Duration of exposure also appeared to be a factor, with symptoms intensifying over time rather than diminishing. Dr. Thorne's medical records from this period document the progression of symptoms among affected community members. Initial effects included mild sleep disruption and occasional vivid dreams. These progressed to more severe insomnia, accompanied by what patients described as waking dreams that occurred during periods of apparent consciousness. Advanced symptoms included reports of auditory phenomena and compelling urges to visit specific locations during nighttime hours. The doctor's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to test his hypothesis by purchasing one of Whitmore's newer acquisitions, a remarkably soft hide that the trader claimed came from a young deer. Dr. Thorne placed the hide in his own bedroom as a wall covering and documented his subsequent experiences in his medical journal. First night. No unusual occurrences. Sleep normal, though perhaps deeper than typical. Dreams more vivid than usual, but not disturbing in nature. Awakened feeling unusually refreshed despite the standard 7 hours of rest. Second night. Vivid dreams of being in locations I have never visited, characterized by unusual geological formations and plant life. The dreams possessed a clarity that made them seem more like memories than imagination. Particularly notable was the consistent appearance of underground chambers carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. Third night, awakened at approximately 3:30 a.m. by what I can only describe as whispering. The sound seemed to emanate from the hide itself, though careful examination revealed no visible source. The whispers used words in no language I recognize, yet somehow conveyed meaning that suggested invitation or instruction. Upon investigation, I found nothing, yet the sensation persisted until dawn. Dr. Thorne's documentation continued for 2 weeks, each entry describing increasingly disturbing experiences. By the 7th night, he reported feeling as though he was not alone in his cabin, despite living by himself. He described an overwhelming sense of being observed and noted that his medical instruments, normally arranged in precise order, were frequently found in different positions each morning. The doctor's scientific training led him to consider various explanations for his experiences. He tested for gas leaks, chemical contamination, and other environmental factors that might cause hallucinations or disorientation. His systematic elimination of conventional causes forced him to consider possibilities that challenged his materialistic worldview. The investigation reached its culmination when Dr. Thorne decided to examine the hide more thoroughly using his surgical instruments. What he discovered challenged his understanding of natural history and biological processes. Hidden beneath the outer fur layer, he found what appeared to be deliberate markings, carved or burned into the flesh before the hide had been cured. These markings formed patterns that resembled no Native American designs he had encountered during his years in Colorado, yet possessed a geometric complexity that suggested intelligent creation. The patterns seemed to follow mathematical principles that created optical effects when viewed under lamplight, appearing to shift and move despite being carved into static material. Most disturbing was Dr. Thorne's discovery that the hide appeared to be composed of sections from multiple animals, expertly joined together in a way that was nearly invisible to casual inspection. The seams where different pieces met had been disguised using techniques that required considerable knowledge of hide processing and anatomical structures. The implications of this finding troubled Dr. Thorne deeply, as it suggested that Whitmore was not simply trading in unusual hides, but was actively modifying them in ways that served some unknown purpose. The level of skill required for such modifications indicated professional training or extensive experience that seemed inconsistent with frontier trading operations. Father Ashford's own investigation followed a different path, focusing on the spiritual and psychological effects he observed among his parishioners. He began conducting what he termed spiritual interviews, carefully questioning couples about their experiences without revealing his growing concerns about Whitmore's trade. The priest's theological training had prepared him to recognize signs of spiritual distress, but the symptoms displayed by affected parishioners didn't match traditional categories. Rather than showing evidence of demonic influence or religious crisis, they seemed to be responding to some form of external communication that operated independently of their conscious awareness. Father Ashford's findings, documented in his personal correspondence, painted a picture of a community gradually falling under some form of influence. He noted that couples who had acquired Whitmore's hides displayed increased isolation, spending more time in their cabins and less time participating in community activities. Their behavior during church services became noticeably different, with affected individuals appearing distracted and unresponsive to familiar liturgical elements. Most concerning to Father Ashford was his observation that these couples gradually stopped attending church services altogether. When he visited their homes to check on their welfare, he found them reluctant to discuss their absence, offering vague explanations about feeling unwell or being too busy with household tasks. The priest's house-to-house visits revealed additional disturbing details about the affected family's changing behavior patterns. They had begun modifying their daily routines to accommodate activities that they couldn't clearly explain. Couples reported spending hours engaged in what they described as preparation work, without being able to specify what they were preparing for. Adults in affected families displayed particularly troubling changes. Previously active and social individuals became withdrawn and secretive, spending long periods alone in their rooms or wandering near the edges of the settlement. When questioned about their activities, they provided answers that seemed rehearsed or coached, as though they had been instructed on appropriate responses. In March 1893, the situation reached a crisis point when the Henderson couple disappeared entirely from their cabin. John Henderson and his wife Martha had been among Whitmore's most frequent customers, having decorated their entire cabin with his hides and regularly purchasing additional items for trade with other families. The Henderson couple's disappearance occurred during a period of severe weather that should have made travel impossible. Snow had been falling continuously for 3 days, creating drifts that blocked most trails and made navigation extremely dangerous. The couple had been seen at the general store 2 days before their disappearance, purchasing supplies that suggested no intention of immediate travel. When neighbors noticed that no smoke had risen from their chimney for 3 days, Dr. Thorne and Father Ashford organized a search party. The severe weather conditions required careful planning and coordination to ensure the searchers' safety while conducting a thorough investigation of the Henderson property and surrounding area. The cabin was found in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained in their usual places. Food was fresh in the pantry, and the couple's horse and other livestock appeared well cared for. The beds had been slept in but were neatly made, suggesting that the disappearance had occurred after a normal night's rest. The only unusual detail was that all of Whitmore's hides had been removed from the walls, leaving behind cleaner patches on the log surfaces where they had hung. The hides themselves were nowhere to be found within the cabin, though careful searching revealed no obvious method by which they could have been removed without leaving traces in the snow around the building. A thorough search of the surrounding area revealed no tracks or signs of the couple's departure. The mountain snow should have preserved clear evidence of any movement, yet even Josiah Brennan's expert tracking skills found no trace of where the Hendersons might have gone. The absence of footprints or sled tracks in the fresh snow suggested that the couple had somehow departed without touching the ground around their cabin. The search party's investigation expanded to include the family's root cellar, a partially underground storage space used for preserving food through the winter months. The cellar's entrance had been carefully sealed with wooden planks and packed snow, as though someone had taken particular care to ensure it remained undisturbed. The discovery that most disturbed the search party was found when they removed the barrier and entered the root cellar. Hidden beneath several layers of preserved vegetables, they found a collection of the missing hides, but these had been altered in a way that defied explanation. The hides had been sewn together into what appeared to be crude garments, sized for adult wear. Each garment bore the same geometric markings that Dr. Thorne had discovered on his specimen, but carved much more deeply and filled with what appeared to be dried blood. The workmanship showed considerable skill, with seams that had been reinforced and finished, using techniques that seemed to combine traditional hide-working methods with innovations that served unknown purposes. The garments varied in size and design, suggesting they had been created for specific individuals rather than mass production. Measurements indicated they would fit the Henderson couple, though certain modifications suggested they were intended for use under conditions quite different from normal mountain weather. Father Ashford immediately declared the cabin and its contents to be spiritually contaminated, refusing to allow anyone to handle the altered hides. His reaction was based not on superstition, but on careful observation of the psychological effects that contact with similar materials had produced in other community members. The priest organized a group of men to burn the entire contents of the root cellar, but the destruction proved more difficult than expected. The hides seemed to resist combustion, requiring multiple attempts and unusual amounts of fuel to destroy completely. When flames finally took hold, they produced an unusual blue color and an acrid smoke that caused severe respiratory distress among the destruction party. Most disturbing was the observation that the smoke seemed to form patterns in the air, resembling the geometric designs they had found carved throughout Whitmore's operation. The patterns appeared to have structure and meaning, as though the burning materials were attempting to communicate some final message before their destruction. The Henderson couple's disappearance galvanized the community's opposition to Whitmore's presence. A town meeting was called, and by unanimous decision, the trader was banned from entering the settlement. Several armed men were assigned to patrol the valley's entrances with orders to turn Whitmore away should he attempt to return. However, Whitmore's reaction to this banishment proved as unsettling as his original presence. Rather than protesting or attempting negotiation, he simply smiled when informed of the decision and replied, "The arrangement has served its purpose. Your people have been prepared for the next phase." The trader's calm acceptance of banishment suggested that the community's decision aligned with his own plans rather than disrupting them. His reference to the next phase implied that his trading operation had been merely preparatory for some larger objective that no longer required his direct presence in the valley. He then loaded his pack horse and departed toward Dead Horse Canyon, but not before leaving a final statement. Those who have worn the gifts will understand their obligation when the time comes. The phrase, "worn the gifts," seemed to reference the garments found in the Henderson root cellar, suggesting that similar preparations had been made throughout the community. The meaning of Whitmore's parting words became apparent over the following weeks. Several couples who had purchased his hides began exhibiting increasingly strange behavior. They started leaving their cabins at night, walking in groups toward Dead Horse Canyon despite the continued harsh weather and dangerous conditions. These nocturnal processions were witnessed by various residents who described the participants as moving with unusual purpose and apparent indifference to the cold. The walkers traveled in pairs, following paths that seemed to require no conscious navigation despite the darkness and snow-covered terrain. Dr. Thorne attempted to intercept one of these groups, consisting of 3 couples who had been among Whitmore's best customers. When he approached them, they acknowledged his presence but seemed unable to explain their behavior. They claimed to be following instructions they had received in dreams, though they could not articulate the nature or source of these instructions. Their eyes, Dr. Thorne wrote in his journal, possessed a quality I had never before observed in living humans. They appeared alert and intelligent, yet somehow distant, as though the individuals I was addressing were observing me from some great remove. When I asked where they were going, they pointed toward the canyon and said they had been called to gather. The phrase seemed rehearsed, as though they had been coached on appropriate responses to interference. The doctor's attempts to physically prevent the group from continuing their journey proved futile. While they did not resist or become hostile, they demonstrated a determination that bordered on the supernatural. Despite Dr. Thorne's blocking their path and his appeals to their reason, they simply walked around him and continued toward their destination. The walkers' apparent immunity to persuasion or physical interference suggested that whatever compelled their behavior operated at a level beyond conscious control. They seemed driven by an imperative that overrode normal human responses to authority, social pressure, or personal relationships. Father Ashford organized a larger intervention, gathering all the remaining community members to prevent what he feared might be additional disappearances. However, when the rescue party reached Dead Horse Canyon the following morning, they found no trace of the missing couples. The canyon showed no evidence of human presence, despite the fresh snow that should have preserved clear tracks. The search party conducted a systematic examination of every accessible area within the canyon, finding no footprints, campfire remains, or other signs that would indicate where the missing couples might have gone. Most disturbing was their discovery of Whitmore's abandoned trading post. The cabin appeared to have been vacant for months, rather than the few days since his departure. Dust covered all surfaces, the fireplace contained only cold ashes, and the structure itself seemed to be deteriorating at an accelerated rate. The rapid decay of Whitmore's cabin suggested that his presence had somehow maintained the building's integrity through unnatural means. Without his influence, The structure was reverting to a condition more consistent with years of abandonment rather than recent occupation. When Dr. Thorne examined the building more closely, he found that the wooden walls had been carved with the same geometric patterns they had discovered on the modified hides. However, these carvings appeared to be much older than Whitmore's recent residence, suggesting that the patterns had been present before his arrival, or that his modifications had somehow accelerated aging in the surrounding materials. Inside the cabin, the search party found evidence of Whitmore's true activities. Hanging from the rafters were dozens of partially completed hide garments, each crafted with meticulous attention to the same pattern they had seen in the Henderson cabin. The workmanship showed a level of skill and consistency that indicated long experience with such projects. Tools for hide preparation were arranged around a central work area, along with substances that Dr. Thorne could not identify, but which emitted the same sweet, cloying odor that had characterized Whitmore's trade goods. Chemical analysis of these substances proved impossible with available equipment, but their properties suggested organic compounds that had been processed using techniques unknown to conventional tanning methods. Most shocking was the discovery of a detailed map painted on one wall, showing not only the Crestone Valley area, but extending to mountain regions throughout Colorado Territory and beyond. Various locations were marked with symbols matching the geometric patterns, suggesting that Whitmore's operation extended far beyond their small community. The map revealed a network of locations that stretched across multiple territories, with connecting lines that seemed to indicate travel routes or communication pathways. Each marked location was annotated with symbols that appeared to represent different phases or types of activity, suggesting a coordinated operation involving multiple sites and personnel. Father Ashford's examination of the map revealed annotations in multiple languages, including what appeared to be Native American pictographs, Spanish colonial references, and symbols he could not identify. Several locations were marked with dates stretching back to the 1860s, indicating that Whitmore's activities had been ongoing for decades. The multilingual annotations suggested involvement by individuals from various cultural backgrounds, possibly including people with formal education in multiple academic disciplines. The complexity and scope of the documented operation far exceeded what frontier communities should have been able to organize or support. The priest's discovery of a collection of correspondence hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards provided additional insight into the scope of Whitmore's operations. Letters in various hands described similar hide trading activities in remote communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The correspondence referenced preparation phases, collection schedules, and harvest periods, in language that suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple individuals. One letter, dated 6 months before Whitmore's arrival in Crestone Valley, contained particularly disturbing content. Written by someone identified only as M. Fletcher, it stated, "The Colorado specimens have shown remarkable adaptation rates. Subjects exposed to the prepared materials demonstrate the expected behavioral modifications within 3 to 4 weeks. Recommend proceeding to final phase during spring migration period, when missing subjects can be attributed to natural hazards." The clinical language used in this correspondence suggested involvement by individuals with scientific or medical training. The systematic approach to human experimentation implied resources and organization that extended far beyond simple criminal enterprise. References to specimens and adaptation rates indicated that the missing community members were being subjected to some form of deliberate modification or testing. Dr. Thorne's medical training led him to interpret this correspondence as evidence of a large-scale experimental program using human subjects. The clinical language and systematic approach suggested involvement by individuals with scientific education rather than simple criminal activity. This realization forced him to consider the possibility that Whitmore represented part of a larger organization with resources and objectives that extended beyond conventional commerce or crime. The search party's investigation was cut short when they noticed that daylight was fading rapidly and they faced the prospect of remaining in the canyon overnight. Father Ashford insisted on immediate departure, expressing fears that prolonged exposure to the site might result in additional disappearances. The priest's insistence on immediate departure reflected his growing understanding that the canyon itself might pose dangers beyond simple environmental hazards. His observations of affected community members suggested that proximity to locations associated with Whitmore's activities could intensify the behavioral modifications they had experienced. However, before leaving, they attempted to destroy the cabin and its contents. Their efforts to burn the structure proved as difficult as their earlier attempt to destroy the modified hides. The wood seemed to resist combustion, requiring multiple applications of accelerant and repeated ignition attempts. When flames finally took hold, they produced an unusual blue color and an acrid smoke that caused severe respiratory distress among the search party members. Dr. Thorne noted that the smoke seemed to form patterns in the air, resembling the geometric designs they had found throughout Whitmore's operation. The patterns formed by the burning cabin's smoke appeared to have structure and meaning, creating shapes that resembled symbols from the mysterious map and correspondence they had discovered. Some search party members reported feeling compelled to watch these smoke patterns despite the respiratory distress they caused. The community's attempts to report these events to territorial authorities met with limited success. The nearest law enforcement was located more than 50 miles away in the town of Alamosa, and communication was hampered by continued severe weather that made travel extremely dangerous. When a message finally reached territorial headquarters in Denver, the response was delayed by bureaucratic confusion over jurisdictional responsibility and resource allocation. The remote location of Crestone Valley and the complexity of the reported events made it difficult for authorities to determine appropriate investigative procedures. Marshal Cornelius Beckwith, who finally arrived in late April 1893, found a community that seemed reluctant to discuss the recent events in detail. The remaining residents provided carefully limited accounts that focused on economic hardship and environmental challenges while omitting the more disturbing aspects of their recent experiences. Beckwith's official report, filed with territorial headquarters in Denver, described the situation as a case of population dispersal due to harsh winter conditions and economic hardship. He noted the disappearance of several couples, but attributed this to migration to lower elevations in search of better opportunities. The marshal's simplified explanation reflected either genuine misunderstanding of the situation or deliberate minimization of the unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearances. His report made no mention of Whitmore or the physical evidence discovered in Dead Horse Canyon, suggesting that either he failed to conduct a thorough investigation or was instructed to limit his findings. However, Dr. Thorne's private correspondence with medical colleagues in Denver tells a different story. In letters written after the marshal's visit, the doctor expressed frustration with the official response and concern that the remaining community members had been instructed to minimize their accounts of recent events. The doctor suspected that territorial authorities were aware of activities similar to those conducted by Whitmore and preferred to avoid detailed investigation. His correspondence suggested that official policy might involve tolerating or even facilitating such operations in remote areas where they would attract minimal public attention. Father Ashford's reports to his diocese were similarly edited in their official versions. His public correspondence focused on the community's spiritual needs following the departure of several couples, while his private letters revealed his continued concern about the supernatural aspects of their recent experiences. The priest noted that several remaining community members continued to display behavioral changes that suggested ongoing influence from their contact with Whitmore's materials. These changes included persistent sleep disturbances, increasing social isolation, and what he described as spiritual disorientation that made traditional religious counseling ineffective. The summer of 1893 brought additional unsettling developments. Despite the departure of Whitmore and the couples most closely associated with his trade, the remaining residents reported continued unusual experiences. These included persistent dreams featuring the same unknown landscapes that Dr. Thorne had documented, unexplained sounds from Dead Horse Canyon, and the occasional discovery of animal remains that displayed the same modifications found in Whitmore's hide preparations. The discovery of modified animal remains throughout the summer months suggested that whatever processes Whitmore had initiated continued to operate independently of his direct supervision. Local hunters began finding deer, elk, and smaller animals that bore the same geometric scarring patterns found on Whitmore's trade goods. These discoveries troubled the remaining hunters, as the modifications appeared to have been made on living animals that subsequently returned to their natural behavior patterns. The scarring had healed completely, indicating that the modifications were not fatal and might serve some ongoing purpose related to the animal's integration into whatever system Whitmore had established. Evangeline Kessler's household ledger from this period documents a gradual decline in community cohesion. Trade with outside suppliers became irregular, as rumors spread among travelers about strange happenings in Crestone Valley. Several supply wagons that had planned to service the settlement changed their routes, forcing residents to travel increasingly long distances for basic necessities. The breakdown in normal commercial relationships reflected growing awareness among regional traders that Crestone Valley had become associated with unusual risks. Stories circulated about travelers who had visited the area and returned with reports of disturbing experiences that paralleled those of the community residents. The Kessler couple themselves began experiencing difficulties that seemed connected to their extensive dealings with Whitmore. Evangeline wrote of persistent dreams in which she found herself walking toward Dead Horse Canyon, compelled by voices speaking in unfamiliar languages. Her husband noted changes in her behavior, including a tendency to spend long periods staring toward the canyon and a gradual loss of interest in her previous activities and responsibilities. Dr. Thorne documented similar symptoms among other community members who had maintained the longest exposure to Whitmore's materials. He noted a progression of symptoms that began with sleep disturbances and gradually developed into what he termed directional compulsion, an increasing urge to travel toward Dead Horse Canyon despite conscious recognition that such behavior was irrational. The doctor's attempts to treat these symptoms using conventional medical approaches proved ineffective. Standard sedatives provided no relief for the sleep disturbances, and patients seemed unable to resist the compulsive behaviors even when they expressed strong desire to do so. Most troubling was Dr. Thorne's observation that the symptoms appeared to be progressive, becoming more severe over time rather than diminishing. This suggested that whatever agent caused the behavioral modifications continued to affect patients long after their direct contact with Whitmore's materials had ended. Father Ashford's spiritual counseling efforts met with similar lack of success. Prayers, blessings, and other religious interventions seemed to provide temporary comfort but no lasting relief from the symptoms affecting community members. The priest noted in his correspondence that affected individuals often expressed feeling called to fulfill some obligation they could not clearly define but felt unable to ignore. Traditional concepts of moral responsibility and personal choice seemed inadequate to address compulsions that operated independently of conscious decision-making. By autumn 1893, the situation had deteriorated to the point where only a handful of couples remained in Crestone Valley. The Kesslers, Dr. Thorne, Father Ashford, and 2 other couples comprised the entire remaining population. Most had stayed due to practical considerations, lack of resources for relocation, responsibility for property they could not abandon, or, in Dr. Thorne's case, professional obligation to continue documenting the unusual medical phenomena he was observing. The approaching winter brought a sense of impending crisis to the remaining residents. Evangeline Kessler's ledger entries from October 1893 reflect growing anxiety about their ability to maintain normal community functions with so few people. More concerning were her increasingly frequent references to dreams and visions that seemed to be directing her behavior during waking hours. "I find myself drawn repeatedly to the canyon," she wrote, "not from curiosity, but from a sense of obligation I cannot explain. In my dreams I see the missing couples gathered in places that exist beneath the earth, in chambers carved from living rock. They appear content, engaged in activities I do not understand, but which seem to serve some greater purpose." Dr. Thorne's medical journal from this period documents his growing realization that the phenomena affecting the community were beyond conventional scientific explanation. His training had not prepared him to address symptoms that seemed to operate independently of normal physiological processes. Most disturbing was his recognition that he was beginning to experience the same symptoms he had been documenting in other patients. "I must acknowledge," he wrote in November 1893, "that my role as objective observer has been compromised. The same compulsions I have documented in others now affect my own thinking and behavior." Father Ashford faced a similar crisis of understanding. His theological training provided no framework for addressing what he was observing in his remaining parishioners. His letters to the diocese became increasingly desperate, requesting guidance for dealing with spiritual problems that seemed to exist outside traditional religious categories. The winter of 1893-94 would prove to be the final chapter in Crestone Valley's existence as a functioning community. By January 1894, territorial supply records indicate that no trade goods were delivered to the settlement, suggesting that the remaining residents had either departed or ceased maintaining normal commercial relationships. The last documented communication from Crestone Valley was a letter written by Evangeline Kessler in February 1894, addressed to her sister-in-law in Denver but never sent. The letter was discovered years later among papers found in the abandoned Kessler store. "Dear sister, I write this knowing it will likely never reach you, but I feel compelled to record what has happened to our small community. The couples who disappeared last spring were not lost, as we initially believed. They found what they were seeking in the deeper places beneath Dead Horse Canyon." The letter continued with descriptions of underground chambers and the work being performed there by the missing community members. Evangeline described these activities as serving something much larger than our individual concerns, and expressed no desire for rescue or return to conventional society. The letter was unsigned and appeared to have been written in haste, with several words crossed out and rewritten. Found alongside it was Evangeline's household ledger, its final entries consisting of geometric patterns rather than household accounts. Territorial records indicate that Crestone Valley was officially abandoned in the spring of 1894. Subsequent attempts to resettle the area failed, with new residents reporting the same disturbing experiences that had affected the original community. In 1923, a geological survey team attempted to map Dead Horse Canyon for potential mining operations. Their official report described the canyon as geologically unstable and unsuitable for resource extraction. However, private notes maintained by team leader Harrison Webb, discovered in mining company archives in 1957, provided additional details about their findings. Webb's team had discovered extensive cave systems beneath the canyon, featuring chambers that appeared to have been artificially expanded and modified. The survey team's exploration was cut short when several members began experiencing symptoms similar to those documented among Crestone Valley residents. 2 team members disappeared during the final night of the survey, abandoning their equipment to venture deeper into the caves. The mining company immediately canceled all development plans for the area and classified Webb's report as confidential. The caves were sealed with dynamite charges, though subsequent geological surveys indicated that the explosive attempts had limited success in blocking access to the deeper passages. Dr. Malcolm Strickland, a psychiatrist from the University of Colorado who investigated the case in 1947, concluded that the community had fallen victim to shared psychological delusions. However, his private research notes revealed significant doubts about his published conclusions. The area was designated as a National Forest Preserve in 1952, effectively placing it under federal protection and limiting public access. Hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who venture into the preserve occasionally report experiences that echo those documented during the 1893 events. Recent reports from contemporary hikers continue to document experiences that parallel those recorded throughout the area's history. Modern technology has added new dimensions to these accounts, with GPS devices occasionally recording travel to coordinates that hikers have no memory of visiting. The case of Zachariah Whitmore and the Crestone Valley community represents one of the most thoroughly documented yet least understood disappearances in Colorado territorial history. Despite extensive investigation by multiple researchers over several decades, no satisfactory explanation has emerged for the coordinated vanishing of an entire community. The geometric patterns, modified animal remains, and sophisticated cave modifications discovered in the area suggest involvement by individuals with knowledge and resources that seem inconsistent with late 19th century frontier capabilities. Most troubling is the apparent ongoing nature of whatever processes were initiated by Whitmore's activities in the 1890s. The continued reports of unusual experiences by visitors to the area suggest that the Crestone Valley events represented the beginning rather than the conclusion of some larger pattern of activity. For those who venture into the remote mountain regions where these events occurred, the Crestone Valley case serves as a reminder that some places maintain their own logic. Some invitations cannot be refused once fully understood.